Hey guys, I want to say thank you so much for checking out my last video. It was the first one that I had done with some real depth and actual analysis of a game, and it was for one that I had really come to appreciate. It was the Ghost of Tsushima, and for everyone that had stopped and checked it out, like seriously, man, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it more than I can honestly put into words. Like I haven't stopped smiling, just getting a little bit of feedback, getting everyone to view it, making sure that everyone kind of was on the same page or being able to get an opinion for a game that they've been on the fence about. So having that little bit of information out there for everyone is just it I don't know how else to put it, man. It means a lot to me. And for everyone that took the time to watch the video, thank you so much. If you'd like to view the video, it's down in the description at the end. And yeah, let's get it started. So there are so many types of games that come out over the span of pretty much like the inception of gaming that it's like there's just one word that really sticks to some, and it's legacy. When it comes to Final Fantasy VII, like the game came out in 1997. I was born in 1995, so I was never really, old enough to understand and play a game of this magnitude, at least at the time. And the more that I heard about it growing up, and the more that I would see the cover and cases, and how much people would go back and review the game, it always made me wonder, like, man, like this game must really, it just got to be the joint, you know what I'm saying? So it's looking like one of those types of games where it's like, man, if you don't play it once, you're not, you've never really played a video game, you've never really enjoyed playing games before. My background with a lot of these types of games is honestly more so when it comes to action games. Like it's more like Ratchet and Clank at the time that I was a child, and then growing up, it was like, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, Ratchet and Clank. RPGs never really took a shine to me until I tried one Final Fantasy game, and it was Final Fantasy Tactics, and it was the War of the Lions version on the PSP. So since then, I've taken more time, since around the time that I think I was like 12, 13 years old, to try to play different RPGs growing up. So I had to play games like Disgaea and, a couple of Final Fantasy games, and then at one point I had seen Final Fantasy 13, and rolling back into the word legacy, a lot of people had high expectations when they had played, Final Fantasy X, and then they played 12, and then they get 13, and it was such a huge departure from what people had come to expect, as far as it goes for being able to explore worlds and being able to just have a little bit more of an in-depth control of how they want to go about the story and whatnot. It was a lot more linear. That in and of itself is a little bit more ironic because Final Fantasy VII Remake was received so well, but it's probably the most linear experience you're going to get out of a Final Fantasy game to date, and it is also a huge departure from what had originally made it what people had come to be excited for in Final Fantasy VII, as not only a brand but as a legacy title in the Square rollout as far as games go. So we have finally gotten Final Fantasy VII, and now it's like people are just they received it. Some people loved it, some people had gripes about it, some people hated it. My experience with Final Fantasy VII, like the original, didn't actually come in until about last year, and I was traveling from the States and I was getting ready to move to Japan, so I needed something to play, so I brought it along with me along our flights, our little time on the road. I had it on the Switch and I played it through, and I was like, man, this is a really good game. I could really see why people would have clung to it so heavily, especially in the time in which gaming was starting to make a lot of different turns. It went around the time in which you had like games on the PlayStation coming out that were making definite waves, and you had like games on the Nintendo 64, and not too many years after that, you had games coming out on other consoles that would just define what it is to enjoy a video game, even if it was in just specific genres. Final Fantasy VII was like it's a key title in gaming history, so knowing that, no matter how you want to break it down or how you want to look at it, if you play video games, you probably heard of Final Fantasy VII. But when it comes to Final Fantasy VII Remake, there's a lot of things that are key differences to what it was that made the grandfather RPG title of gaming at this point, somewhat off, I guess I want to say. The game itself stands up extremely well as far as it goes for just playing it if you've never been introduced to Final Fantasy VII like I was as a kid, but like it's one of those amazing godlike RPG titles, but you want to give it a shot. It's definitely worth playing. I would say if you want to read like a quick little summary of what made Final Fantasy VII's story so great, or if you just want to read the story itself, There are plenty of articles on it. There's too many reviews to count. The game is easily accessible. It's extremely cheap almost anywhere you look for it, especially on PSN. So if you want to go out and try it out, it's a game that's worth playing through as long as you have like the time to do so. A little bit of it can be a little, I don't want to just say tricky, but some of it is like, you'll be like, man, I thought I had just, walked a pretty clear and straightforward path somewhere, but you might miss something that you might need later on. So don't be afraid to, either ask someone that's a little bit more experienced or look up a guide or something, because it was in that era of gaming where you kind of just had to go through and try to figure things out and try to explore and find out however much you could to try to make sure that you were as prepped as you could for the next step in the story. Getting into Final Fantasy VII Remake, now that you kind of know that Final Fantasy VII originally was like, it is the RPG when it comes to gaming almost in general. There's hardly any that really just like stick up to it aside from other older Final Fantasy titles itself, like 8 and 9, 6 if you enjoyed that one as well. But it's like Square Enix had pretty much like they had a chokehold on when it came to RPGs and gaming as a whole. So when it comes down to it, you see it and you're just like, man, like I really don't know what to expect. But I heard about Final Fantasy VII like almost my entire life, but I have no real experience with it. I don't understand the expectation. And that's fine, because I didn't really have too much of a reason to care too much about, the actual original Final Fantasy VII until I heard there was going to be a remake. So sometimes it's like when you don't have that previous experience with it, it's not going to ring the same to you. You're not going to be the kind of person that's been waiting like effectively 23 years for a remake for a game that you never played, and you might only be like 19, 20, 21. I'm 25, so it's like the game may not have that deep of an impact on you now in comparison to someone who's been waiting since they were either a teenager, a young adult, a child, a middle schooler, whatever, whose first experience in gaming at an impactful stage was one of the most impactful RPGs ever. So the expectation for Final Fantasy VII's remake, it was almost as high as the expectation for Final Fantasy XIII. It's one of those games where it's like, because of the legacy of Final Fantasy games are so high and the precedent for greatness has pretty much been established over almost 3 decades now at this point, it could only really measure up so much because the expectations for new Final Fantasy games are so high. Just like when Final Fantasy 15 had come out and everyone was more so excited for it, but the expectation for a brand new Final Fantasy 15 specifically had been ranging for a decade. And then it came out, and then it was like moderately well received. It had a lot of criticisms. It had a lot of positive It had a lot of great reception from a lot of core fans, and a lot of those core fans also were the ones who were divvying out those harsher criticisms, and they just had a lot of things they didn't like. But in actuality, like, the game itself measured up about as well as a Final Fantasy game would. Like, it had the method of exploration, it had the leveling system, it had the story. That one was a little bit more linear when it came to what it was that you were focusing on in comparison to older titles. But Final Fantasy 15 actually just kind of lays out what it is that you're there to do, why you need to care about the characters, why you care about this road trip that you're on. But harkening back through to Final Fantasy VII with the remake, Final Fantasy VII Remake had already been laid out with the groundwork for a good story to go off of. Final Fantasy VII Remake was pretty good off jump because you had immediately been exposed to reliving that first scene of Cloud jumping off the train in Midgar. Everyone was pretty much infiltrating the city. They were heading on through into the Maka reactor. It was pretty cool because at the end of the day, you know what it is that you're there to do. If you've played Final Fantasy VII, if you're familiar with the beginning, the middle, the end, you know that this game is going to take place in the very first part of what was originally the first game, but the entire game is now the first part. There's a lot that can be said for why that would be a good thing and why it could be either a risky thing, it could be taken in as dicey when it comes to criticism, etc. But at the end of the day, Final Fantasy VII Remake had definitely struck a lot of great chords, for me at least, but I don't have that initial bias for when it comes to how long I've been waiting for the game. I played this after playing Final Fantasy VII through last year, and then I played it as soon as it released earlier this year in the spring. So I had spent the first 3 days making sure I had gone through and played as much of it as I could on my own, and then going through with the playthrough. And then after I beaten it, I had started a hard mode, and now I'm about like 71% or so completed with the trophy list on PlayStation Network. I had stopped trying again because, you know, I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty tedious. Trying to get through the rest of that one is a task, and it's something I might roll back and complete. But the reasons why I would say that Final Fantasy VII Remake might not hit home for everyone is because A, it's not what you're expecting it to be if you're going in thinking that it's going to be exactly like Final Fantasy VII. That in and of itself can kind of set the game up to take a negative hit from long-standing fans, because those fans will have that frame of mind of what to expect based on what they knew from 20 plus years ago. You can call it nostalgia goggles, you can call it whatever you want to, but at the end of the day, it's very much true that the game is just its own beast at this point. It doesn't handle poorly at all. Like, the game is actually pretty great, but as far as it goes for the initial negatives that come through for Final Fantasy VII Remake as its own title, the game honestly is missing some of the initial portions of Midgar, but they filled in those portions with other elements of story for the characters that we didn't really know that well, like Jesse and Biggs and Wedge, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time I can see why it will be taken down as criticism as a bad thing. But the real key things that kind of made it, you know, not shine as well as it could have may have been some of the pacing, story wise, and then while you're actually going through and trying to take care of and complete specific missions, or when you're just navigating through certain parts of the map, it's like there were so many parts of the game where it was just like I didn't want to go through it because I felt like it was becoming more and more of a task just to play it. There were instances where it's like I'd have to take like almost a minute plus trying to climb around. Like, let's say I'm climbing around a roof of a church, and then I had to drop down, climb back up, hop back around, try to avoid some enemies, climb back around, and then it's like all that just to get to the end of a door, just to go and run down a hallway and then go through and open up a door that takes like a couple seconds and whatnot. So I think that was a pretty detrimental part to include in any game these days. I think that's a bad thing, to try to make every little bit of interaction with the environment either a cinematic or takes so long that it does not immediately flow. Like, as strong as Cloud, Tifa, Barrett, and even Aerith are, they should be able to like hop up and just go screaming across some monkey bars, you know. Like, there should be no reason why it takes Cloud like almost a minute to traverse, or not even have the ability to jump a great distance, even if it's a moderate one, from like one end of a hall to another over a giant gap over an elevated piece of a church. Like, there was a lot of things that I think they could have did to make the game a little bit more, I don't want to say suspenseful, but they could have used some more action sequencing or something to make it more interactive, as opposed to just feeling like I have to hold the stick in one direction to watch our characters either climb or navigate a piece of the environment that didn't really, you know, do too much to help me enjoy the game itself. Following up, also a lot of things that were kind of, like I had mentioned earlier, brought into the game to kind of fill in what they did not allow to be a part of the initial game, were unnecessary story aspects. It was kind of cool to be able to see some of how like these characters lived on their own, like Biggs, Wedge, Jesse, you know, even meeting like your own I don't know why we're meeting the landlady, but that was like a unique decision. So it's cool to be able to meet these characters and to understand these characters, and a lot of these things could have just been conversations, or maybe if it was all just one mission where you learn more and more bit by bit as the regular main story goes on. But a lot of what was going on in the game was like a whole mission dedicated to Jessie, and even if you're just trying to be a completionist, you need to do a specific, you know, a specific task on the bike to try to get her approval to just try to make sure you get that trophy. Like, that whole segment, honestly, we could have been without, but at the same time, I understand the need to develop a bond with the characters, but because so many of these segments were so drawn out, it made me feel more like it was a task as opposed to feeling like it was a part of a fun journey or a sick, you know, part of the action or anything that made me care about these characters, and that really was just a negative draw on me. And finally, like as far as it goes for cons in this one, I would definitely say the fact that you can't play Red 13. I think that was a big miss. I'm not sure if someone had already went through and explained or had potentially addressed as to why that was. I think there may be an article on it. Forgive me if I'm misspeaking on that, but when it came to not being able to use Red 13 and only being limited to the first 4 characters that you're given in the game, I did not like that at all. I wanted to be able to play as Red 13. I wanted to, be there and watch as he actually jumped Hojo. And I don't even think he got close to touching Hojo in the story, if I'm remembering correctly. Like, I'm a little bit late on doing this video on it, so I might have to go back and play through that mission again. But he ain't even touch Hojo. That was like one of the coolest parts of the original game. Like, he could have been through and he could have jumped him, scratched him, scared him, barked at something. Like, there was literally nothing that had happened between Red 13 or like anything. Like, there was no kind of like retribution. He ain't getting no revenge. He ain't getting no kind of nothing. This is like a legendary race warrior dog that's supposed to be, like this super badass kind of character in this game, and it's like half the time all he did was just, perform parkour off of some pipes. We're kind of just stuck like what's really going on here, so not to really spoil the story if you don't know Final Fantasy VII at this point, but that's not my fault. The game's over 20 something years old at this point. If you don't know that by now, that's your fault. But not all things about Final Fantasy VII Remake were negative, so let's talk about some of the good things, because honestly, the game hit a lot of marks really well. So initially, this is one of the best looking games on the PlayStation 4. Like, when I had used this game in reference to everything I was comparing as far as what is on the PS4 right now in the Ghost of Tsushima video, I meant it. Like, this game was honestly one of those titles where it's like, if you have not played it, you need to. It's one of those, like, how on PS3 everyone would mention, playing like God of War or whatever, but this, PS4, it's like, Horizon Zero Dawn and all that stuff. Final Fantasy VII Remake is one of those like hallmark titles for a specific console that I think everyone should play. Moving on into what it is that makes, lets the game make its own impact. Positively, I would say that it's more of like the fact that the game can make its own changes to the story without completely discarding its roots. It did make some key changes that I don't want to spoil for people who have not played the game yet, but it made it so now there's a reason for you to care for what comes next, because this game is a remake. It's not, just a port. It's not just a rebuild. It is a remake. Like, remakes usually have like different story elements to their games, and that's just kind of a thing that comes with it. Just like if you had played like the original Ratchet and Clank and then you played the brand new one that came out a few years ago, you might have noticed that a few of the things were different story-wise, but you still enjoy the game. That's the kind of way that you have to take this one bit by bit, and it's still pretty good, honestly. Like, it still handles it handles well, but in regard to Final Fantasy VII, this game does the same thing in that regard. I would have to say that Final Fantasy VII Remake as a game definitely came together at the end, but throughout the game you got to go through a lot of different, elements. You got to go through a lot of like side missions. You got to go through a lot of like mini games, stuff that kind of made people remember Final Fantasy VII for what it was to begin with. So there were things there to make you care about the game, the characters, the world, and whatnot. Give you a little bit more of a motivation and a reason to go about and be like, hey, I care about this game. This is why. This is what's going on. But there's so many things within the game that are worth doing, and some of them were a little bit more of a task. So at the end of the day, I would just say that this game could be a great jump off point for what's to come. But as far as it goes for right now, I would have to give this game, I would say if you want to rate it on a scale out of 10, it's definitely a solid 7 out of 10, not to like make jokes about the title. But Final Fantasy VII Remake is one of those games where it's like, it has the curse of legacy. Like, there is almost no way, like, it has the curse of legacy. There's no real way to get around it. It's a great game on its own. It functions really well on its own. It looks amazing. It gives you plenty of stuff going on. There's just the fact that people come to expect such high things from Square Enix, especially with their legacy titles, specifically Final Fantasy, that you can't do something like a remake for Final Fantasy VII without it would have to literally be crafted by the hands of God for it to be considered perfect. It was a great game to play through. It's worth playing through if you have, if you have the time. If you want to wait for a sale, I'd recommend doing that as well. If you have played the original Final Fantasy VII, I'm going to give you the warning and heads up. Do not go into this thinking that it's the exact same thing. It is the first coverage of the first chapter of the original Final Fantasy VII, so you're going to be mostly in Midgar for basically this game. That's just how it's laid out. So how you go about that, at least now you will not be surprised. There is plenty of information if you want to do a little bit more digging. But I would say that if you want to play this game for, honestly, just for the continuation of what you knew Final Fantasy VII to be, it would still be unwise of you to not play it. It's a great game. I've genuinely enjoyed it. I did not have the initial bias of childhood memories of the original Final Fantasy VII. It's worth everyone to go through and try to give this game a chance to play. It's a game that I don't think anybody should miss if they have the means to play it on their PlayStation. If you can afford it, if you can borrow it, you should definitely give it a spin. Overall, I would just say go into this game with the expectation that you're going to be playing a separate new game in and of itself, even though it's marked Final Fantasy VII. It's worth playing. I can't sing its praises high enough when it comes to its individual efforts and its graphics and some of the things that they did with the story that made it more interesting to me than the original game in some ways. But that's why I want to say it's up to you. So if you guys have played Final Fantasy VII, y'all know what I'm talking about when I say these changes are a lot more prevalent than what people who have not played it don't know yet. Or if you have played the original Final Fantasy VII, what were some of the things that you felt like they missed in the Midgar section? Supposedly the second portion of the game is already under development, so that's going to be great. I can't wait for that, whether it be in the next 2-3 years if that comes out. I just hope they take their time and they genuinely, I hope that they boil down some of these climbing segments and take away a lot of these unnecessary, there was just so many unnecessary segments of the game when it came to the story, how it came to you traveling around the world, stuff like that. I just want more game. I want more action. I want more of the necessary story to allow me to progress to more things that I care about. Even if you're going to get it to a point to where you're going to do more things for the actual story that you want to make of, let me say this correctly. If there's going to be more of the story that you want to make new, get me to that, as opposed to making me have to climb around and do all this crazy kind of stuff to walk down more hallways and stuff like that. Get me to a point to where I can care about everything leading to these plot points, and don't let the plot points be the thing that you think is going to carry you into a better point of success with the game. But yeah, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you guys for stopping by and watching it. I appreciate it. I'm going to try to have more ready for you in the future, but for now, that's going to be it. I'll see you in the next one.